Okay, before we start talking about the meat of this video, I have a rhetorical question to ask to you guys. Light mode or dark mode?
Interesting.
That is an age-old question in which for any internet dweller, your answer is most likely the dark one. But is it the case with our brand new 2 Overtriggers that is gonna be releasing in the Festival Collection 2024? That is exactly what I'm gonna be talking about today, and I'll be honest, there is one that is a lot stronger than the others, but it is heavily dependent on how you look at it. As we're starting off with the spiritual king of the bright sky, Merit Sunblear, or the light OT, or the yellow OT, or the peace OT, based on some polls.
That escalated quickly.
But the effects is far from being piss poor because of the fact that this card additional effect allows you to draw additional card for every 2 of your opponent's open circle in rear guard circle and guard circle. Then you can retire of your opponent's rear guards and guardians once you activate this additional effect. This is actually quite a powerful effect because this means that the only way for you to get away from these Overtriggers are usually Sentinels, which make it even scarier if you're using this particular OT in decks like Blankmeyer, Chronojet, or Loronero, which do have a way to force a guard restrict onto you.
Genuinely disgusting.
And in all fairness, this card is also extremely flexible because even if you manage to pull it in the earlier part of the game where there is not a lot of card on the board, it is still a huge plus because you are getting at least 1 additional card from the base OT effect, and depending on how empty your opponent board is, you can get it for up to 3 cards, which is a substantial amount in any deck in general, and that 3 draw can actually make a difference. But there is still a weakness on it, and that is of course the Sentinel, as I mentioned earlier, and any card effects that allow your opponent to prevent your attack completely from being hit onto the target. So cards like Violet from the Prison, Lyle Amorta, and a bad timing of this Overtrigger can actually spell the end for you, especially if you for some reason pull this Overtrigger in the very later part of the game where your deck size is very low, because that means that you are forced to draw a multiple cards in one single instance, causing you to deck out.
Emotional damage!
In all fairness, that might not happen as much, but all of these bad points doesn't outweigh the good point of this deck. The fact that you can destroy your opponent's strategy by simply just guaranteeing your Vanguard attack to hit is such a huge deal. And the scary part of this is that your opponent still have to deal with that 100 million somewhere else because of the fact that, as I mentioned just now, the Vanguard attacks always hit unless you're up against Sentinel. Overall, I do think Merit Sunblear definitely has a really good potential, especially in decks that does exert some kind of guard restrict on the Vanguard itself, or any deck that kind of force your opponent to prepare their Sentinel somewhere else. And speaking of somewhere else or rearguard, we have the night mode of the Overtrigger, Spiritual King of Night Sky, Nixlas Celia. I initially thought this one Niguratia or something, so I preferred my interpretation of it because of the word Nigurat, but this is nice in itself.
Gay!
So what this card additional effect is? Well, it allows you to put 1 card from your damage zone into your hand, and then you can choose up to 1 unique card from your hand, call it to Rear Circle, and it get additional 10k until the end of turn.
Hey, that's pretty good.
So to put in a very simplest form of description as much as possible, this card is essentially a guaranteed heal that can actually increase your hand size because you get 1 draw from the Overtrigger base effect and then 1 from the card that you add from your damage zone, and then you can get a second part of Wound Out by Superior calling additional rear guard that gets additional power. In all fairness, it is not easy to pilot this card, especially we just came back discussing about Merit Sunblear, who is actually a lot easier to use, but what this card provides is a different type of utility that Idas Pharaoh
Did not.
bring. Idas Pharaoh allows you to get anything from your drop zone, which in all fairness in certain decks are very easy to access like Soga or Nirvana, but for this card, this allows you to access damage zone, which is something that based on my knowledge, very few and very little cards actually interact in it, at least in the context of standard. This means that this allows you to fetch card that unfortunately went into damage zone like PG, any of your Persona Ride, any of your key pieces. This can be fetched back from damage zone to your hand, and it essentially treated as a heal.
I mean,
it's alright, like...
But the problem with this card, I feel, kind of boils down to how, unless you are playing certain decks like Vanguard, a lot of decks usually will push their initial multi-attack. The unit that will either get a restand or will be removed from the field afterwards first, and then you use your Vanguard to attack for additional drive check to give more power to your rear guard. This means that the second part of this card is not as useful as you think it is, because for a multi-attack deck, your rear guard will most likely be already in stand position so that you can take additional power somewhere else, which means that this doesn't really increase the number of attack at all.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
But for decks that do that, this is a huge benefit. And I will say this now, this card is definitely generic, but I feel the decks that can utilize it are far and few in between. And for most of them, they are gonna be using it to essentially call additional card to Regard Circle to get a huge buff to certain attack via boost in the back row for certain attack that is not strong enough. Unfortunately, despite I thought this card was a little bit better initially, Nick's last series definitely has a little bit more learning curve of how to utilize it properly in most of the decks. So which one is better, the light mode or the dark mode? Well, just like I already kind of brought out a lot of examples, it kind of depends on what you need from your deck. But if you're looking for a more general use Overtrigger, I do think the light mode win this round. With Mary Sunblare, it's a lot more easier to actually play it while still generate more or less enough benefit for you to rely on compared to Nick Lastelia, which is still a very good OT regardless, but it does have a lot less use case. Similar to the situation of Wow Now and Eidos Pharaoh, where initially we all thought Wow Now gonna be a much stronger Overtrigger compared to Eidos Pharaoh, but Eidos Pharaoh ended up become a stronger one in the long run. But what do you guys think about this light and dark Overtriggers? Do leave down in the comments below. And yeah, that's all I have for today. Take care of yourself, and this is Mac Megane signing out.